You're listening to the Creative Process Podcast. Here you will discover what drives musicians to create music and how they realize that ambition. I'm your host, Jamie Collin, founder of the online independent music magazine, Overblown. Over the course of 4 albums, Boston's Elder have deftly combined the genres of stoner metal, doom metal, and progressive rock. Drawing on influences from Black Sabbath to King Crimson, the group have slowly carved out their own unique and powerful sound. Their latest album, Reflections of a Floating World, was released on June 2nd and sees the group continue to meld adventurousness with accessibility. I spoke to Nick DiSalvo, guitarist and vocalist with the group, about how their creative process has had to change and adapt due to changing life situations, the influence of Japan on the new record, and the place of the album in the modern musical landscape.
So when you're approaching writing and recording a new album, what's kind of the first thing you sit down and do?
It's really hard because I think I'm just now sort of approaching a rhythm or an idea or a mythology to how to write music, because every album has been written under different circumstances. The last 2 albums in particular were mostly written by me kind of just sitting down with my guitar, maybe sitting down with a keyboard and, just jamming through ideas, just improvising, playing. And I usually, when I'm trying to actively write music, I'll be recording everything that I'm doing too, or trying to record, any riffs that come up as interesting. Just trying to build off of ideas. You might be able to record several guitar tracks on top of each other and just kind of play around with ideas and see what sticks. When I start writing music, it's just basically getting the energy to, sit down and set up all of my equipment and really be able to kind of take notes on everything creative that I'm doing. We used to, of course, jam together, and we used to be focused more heavily on collaborative songwriting, but none of us live anywhere near each other anymore, and that's just not possible. So it's kind of, that sort of all just went hand in hand.
But you said that was for the first 2 albums, so it's obviously changed for this one, has it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the first 2 albums we were very heavily aping the kind of music that we listened to, too. And we were kind of just getting our bearings and having fun playing music and playing music together. And there was really no pressure. It was just kind of, let's jam together, let's write some songs and, have fun, and no one's listening. And of course, over the years, people started listening, and maybe that was also part of the need for the songs to be a little bit more refined. And, also we all wanted to make music that was a little bit different than what other bands in the scene were doing. But like I said, also has to do with geography. Now that we don't live near each other, the best thing we can do is really record our ideas and kind of swap them out via the internet and do some sort of peer editing, peer review process there.
I find it kind of interesting that that's the way you do it, because from listening to the music, it really sounds like music that would have been jammed out in a room, 3 guys in a room. You know what I mean? Yeah,
totally. And I mean, that's part of it is, of course, I should say that, when writing an album, on this last album, I probably wrote 80% of everything myself, but a lot of that was kind of with room left open for improvisation in the studio. There were parts where it'd say, okay, this is the part, this is the basic structure, but what we do is going to actually be, when we get in the studio and have our instruments in our hands, that's what's going to come out of it. So there is supposed to be an organic feeling, and certainly we function very organically on stage. We're very used to each other as players, and we have a lot of fun still jamming and just improvising, and certainly we could still write songs that way. We can't at the moment, but yeah, it's always, the albums are supposed to sound very dynamic. They're supposed to have focus parts, and they're supposed to have loose parts, and that's all kind of intentional. So I guess if you interpret it that way, then so much the better. I guess it means we're achieving some goal.
And the new album's called Reflections of a Floating World. And you said that the term the floating world comes from a particular period in Japanese society, which is associated with the flourishing of the arts, but also a self-destructively decadent lifestyle. How did you come across this idea?
I think the idea kind of presented itself because I'm always thinking about big themes in life and in music. I've always thought that it's more interesting to listen to music that speaks to everyone and has something to do with everyone, rather than, songs that are very heavily focused on personal experiences and the ego and whatever. So in the last 2 albums, actually in the last 3 albums now, we've been mostly writing songs that are about things like, to put it in stupidly broad terms, life and death and the human experience and what it means to be a human, and, how to live your life with meaning, stuff like that. After we released Lore, we all kind of changed our lives radically. We all decided that we wanted to pursue music because it's kind of, you might have one chance to do it in your life if you're lucky, and this was maybe going to be ours. So we all just kind of changed our lifestyles completely, put everything else on hold, and started just playing music. That kind of put us in like down an adventurous path where we had a lot of experiences. We really tested ourselves, I think mentally and physically by touring so much, and broke relationships and like made new relationships and new friendships, and it's just kind of been a crazy couple of years of living. It made me think a lot about what life means to me and what's most important and what my priorities were. There were some hard decisions we had to make, but it also, I think it was ultimately the most rewarding choice we could have ever made. So anyhow, fast forward to me trying to write the lyrics for the new album. I was, again, very fascinated by these ideas of, what does it mean to be a human, and how is the best way to live your life fruitfully? And I feel like everyone's trying to do the best they can, but at the same time, it's easy to get sucked into, careers or, just living a standard lifestyle, trying to get money and accrue objects that you don't need, that you'll just throw away later. At the same time, I came across this term. I was actually at a Japanese flea market, and I came across some old Japanese art prints and started doing some research about the time period. I found out about this term, floating world, that refers to the artwork of that period as well. And it all just kind of clicked for me together. It's like, I've been thinking a lot about how decadent life is today, how it's so, capitalist centric. Not a lot of people are thinking about, the big picture or how they could be leading a life that's going to be worth something when they look back on it in 80 years. And it all just kind of came together. I thought it was a beautiful phrase, and it summed up a lot of the lyrical content too. Maybe that's a little long-winded, but that's basically the gist of it.
No, that's all right. I thought it was quite an interesting concept. I'd obviously never heard of the floating world or the term. I think it's ukiyo or something like that, I think.
Yeah. Not sure it's pronounced either ukiyo or something.
Yeah. Could you elaborate a bit on how you think that relates to the world we live in now?
I kind of borrowed, the more negative aspects of that term, because I think the floating world, it referred to this period in Japanese society where people were gaining wealth and the arts were flourishing, but the term itself has a lot to do with the hedonism that comes with luxury and the hedonism that comes with wealth and prosperity. And I mean, we live in a pretty fucked up world nowadays, and it's kind of disturbing. And I in particular been very disturbed by, a lot of behavior I see in my home country of the United States. And I'm disturbed in how people can live their lives, just trying to look out for themselves and trying to just, chase money and chase some false dreams, while the rest of the world kind of goes to shit, or they actively or unknowingly support war and torture and things like this. This happens in an age where we have the possibilities to eradicate things like global hunger, and we could solve the problems facing mankind. We have the money, we have the resources, we have the technology to do it, but still nobody does it. And I don't know, that's kind of the ultimate irony and the ultimate tragedy of the whole situation. We're probably more prosperous as people than we ever have been, withholding disparities, but yet everyone's really just kind of leading these self-destructive lifestyles.
Yeah, I agree with you. To be honest, when I read about it, did a little research about it, it immediately reminded me of kind of the jazz age and how that was such a decadent time, but ultimately kind of led up to 1929 and the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression.
That's an interesting connection I haven't made before, actually.
That's like the first thing that popped into my head, to be honest, which was obviously a great time for the arts and a great time of mainly in America, I suppose, not the world over, but in America, a time of like new freedoms and just post World War I. So everybody was so happy that there was no war. Everybody's going out having a great time. There's great music being created, great art being created, but still very decadent. Lots of partying, lots of probably pointless expenditure, which then inevitably led to a wake-up call.
That is a really great connection. I hadn't made that before. It makes you think it might be human nature. Humans are pretty short-sighted. I think we've proven that throughout history, time and time over again.
Like it's kind of some kind of cyclical thing, and it seems to me that it's even getting kind of closer. The cycles are getting shorter.
Yeah, it definitely does feel like the doomsday clock is ticking, huh?
Yeah.
But it's funny, you also see this. I was also, as a closing thought, I was also kind of disturbed on a personal level by in the years that we've been just pursuing music, being creative and playing music has always been intensely important to me. But I also realized sometimes it was becoming, some nights it was more about like, oh, when do we get to the venue, and like when can we start drinking beer, or like just really pointless, also just very self-destructive and counter productive things that were also kind of just being decadent. You meet a lot of people, and especially in the world of, I don't know, heavy music or something, you've got a lot of substance abuse problems, they come from just overindulgence in all of these. And that's also something that I try to be very conscious of, and, trying to write music because that's what we want to do, and that's what's important. All the other stuff is just fluff,
So obviously it's very, very important for you to have a theme for an album. And why do you think that is?
The albums are I think they're meant to be listened to as a whole, or for me, I appreciate this whole package, this whole, to borrow a German term, Gesamtkunstwerk, this entire whole all-encompassing body of art. That's not just, it's the package, it's the content, and it's the concept, is kind of like a triad or something. That's why we always have worked with the same artist, Adrian Dexter. The artwork is supposed to be closely correlated to the theme and the music, so we work together very closely to make sure the whole thing just feels like one solid piece. For me, that's just a little bit more of the format we're going for, rather than a traditional collection of songs that, can be listened to at will or something. I appreciate when music's got a little bit more concept to it. I think it brings it to another level in some way.
Yeah, it kind of adds a cohesiveness.
Yeah, or adds some value. Maybe just to me, of course.
And this is obviously Elder's third album. And again, the third one that you turn your back on a kind of traditional verse, chorus, verse song structures. Do you ever worry that this in itself could become formulaic?
Yeah, to a certain extent, it actually already has. Even if every song's got its own twists and turns, all of the albums, except for this one, have been made up of 5 songs, and they've all been just long songs. This is actually our 4th full length, and the first one to break the cycle. And that's kind of the main reason that we even added a 6th songs, this jammy track, Sonntag. We wanted to try and start pushing our boundaries in another direction, because we realized, there are other things we can do, and this is getting a little bit predictable too. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to even write shorter songs. I've tried to write shorter songs, but it never quite felt right, or always felt like I was trying to do something that I didn't want to do just for the sake of, being different. That's always something you have to be mindful of. I haven't quite gotten used to writing songs in any other format. I've been playing in this band basically for the bulk of my, time as an adult, and it's kind of shaped my ideas about music as I've shaped the band itself. Hopefully there's more room for experimentation. I don't want to get too predictable, but you're definitely right. There is at some point everything can become a little bit pigeonholed.
But then you wouldn't necessarily rule out in the future being a bit more concise maybe, or exploring other avenues?
The main thing I want to do is never release the same album twice. Mm-hmm. And we're totally open to doing whatever suits us at the moment. After Lore, I felt like we'd gotten to the point where our music had gotten its own voice, and we were writing things that sounded distinctively ours. But I wasn't quite satisfied with some of the songs on that album. They just felt like they could have been tighter. They were thrown together a little bit more. I think that was maybe the main impetus for writing this new album, because a lot of people have said it sounds like Lore version 2, or like part 2 or something, because the songs are it's got the similar aesthetic. And to a certain degree, that is how it was intended to be. We've got the sound and the momentum is going behind it, and I want to write a really good collection of songs that did justice to the idea. But where we go from there is really anyone's guess, I suppose.
So like with this album, it's even kind of like you're trying to perfect nearly what you were doing so far.
Yeah. Or just, the songs, they're written because, this is something that sounds nice, and I'm just writing music for the pure enjoyment of writing music. But subconsciously, I think I was trying to maybe surpass what we had done on the last album, surpass expectations, or surpass just my own expectations of what we could do with this kind of heavy melodic, but also kind of progressive heavy rock, if you will.
Yeah.
I thought like we're on the tracks of something we hadn't quite gotten there yet, and that was just kind of what the intention of this album was to do.
There's a thing about your music actually that I really quite enjoy, is that obviously it's a very winding and progressive and exploratory, but I find that a number of bands who do that, it can get quite oppressive and kind of exhausting for the listener. But I don't find that with your music. Is that something that you actively consider or think about when you're writing? Definitely.
I used to really obsess when I was a kid. I've always had this like collector's mentality to everything I did, and I've always been a collector of CDs, and then and records, and I would obsess and dissect this music with all my friends. And, especially I'd hear songs and I'd be like, well, why does this, like, this is such a great song, but why did they add this part? It totally ruined it, or it felt so thrown together or something. And that became like a weird mantra for me in later years in writing music, that like everything had to sound perfect and there was not going to be any filler unless everything had its own a reason to be there, not just to produce music because you have the means to do it, but do it because you want to say something. And whenever I write music now, technology helps a lot too, because I might record several demos of a song, and throw it on my iPod and listen to it and walk, do my shit, walk around the city, just listen to things, and in different contexts you can hear what fits, what sounds weird, what doesn't, and it's kind of just an endless process of revision that I think makes things sound a bit tighter than if you're really not listening from a whole bunch of perspectives and really not thinking about every part and how they fit in the big puzzle. I guess it's working. The other guys do the same thing. They're they're listening to the songs. Everyone's kind of dissecting them in their own way and trying to make the thing sound as tight and cohesive as possible. I think that's key in long music to hold the listener's attention.
Yeah, because it's a difficult thing, I suppose, particularly in the modern era where people's attention spans, because of the internet, don't seem to be what they were. Like, it seems to me that in the early noughties, the mid-noughties, music was becoming, even mainstream music, lots of it was becoming quite expansive. You had bands like, say, Sigur Rós, bands like ISIS, who were really like getting quite popular and pushing the boundaries as well with what you could do. And then that's kind of been pulled back a bit, I feel, over maybe the last 10 years nearly.
I think you're totally right. Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I even noticed that within I guess it's partly dependent on the format, because if you're listening on your computer, it's easy to just, click forward in a track or skip or something. It's less easy with a record, of course, still possible. But yeah, attention spans, I think there's probably a clinical studies enough to prove that people's attention spans aren't what they used to be.
Well, stepping outside of music, do you have any other kind of creative outlets?
Aside from music, no, not really, not at all. And music's always been my big thing. I've wanted to get involved in visual art and stuff. I've always been interested in language too. There was a time when I was working as a freelance translator too, but fortunately, you never really get thrown anything so creative if you're doing it for money that it actually is fun. So music has always really been my mainstay, and that's pretty much the only thing I'm any good at.
Who in the creative world kind of inspires you, both inside and outside of music?
That's a really hard question to answer, because I feel like oftentimes I'm inspired by everything, and oftentimes it's nothing, and when we're, especially, that's one of the question I'm worst at answering, who are your influences or what inspires you, because I always feel like I'm trying to write music with an empty head or nothing in there as a template. But there was a time when I was super heavily influenced by all things Russian, all Russian literature I could get my hands on, I was consuming. And that for some reason was really inspiring to me and transporting me to a different time, to a different place, to a culture that I always thought was really fascinating. But I mean, mostly it's just lately I gotta say it's fucking old records. It's me. It's old bands that I've been rediscovering, and it's, the days of analog recording, and there's so many hidden gems that I've just been rediscovering over the past years in music. Nothing really current that's been inspiring me. I think I've just been kind of digging into the past. That's been mostly what's informing my musical writing in the past couple of years, I think.
Do any albums spring to mind that have been on the turntable for the last couple of years?
Well, the first band that my bandmates had a really hard time getting me into to progressive rock a couple of years ago, and I think the first band that for some reason clicked with me was Gentle Giant, who was kind of the UK's unsung prog rock heroes. They had a ton of albums. Power and the Glory and Free Hand are some of my favorites of theirs, and also Yes, that came at the same time I started to understand like Yes and King Crimson and those kind of bands, and Motorpsycho is one of our contemporaries, actually the only contemporary band that I always have to mention that's so inspiring, because they're kind of like modern day prog rockers' wet dream. They experiment with so many different sound palettes and stuff like that. Hard to there's a great band from the UK called Diagonal. They were putting out some really interesting kind of like Canterbury prog jazzy records for a couple of years that have always been kind of on and off of my turntable.
And do you think it's something about the ethos of these bands that appeals to you?
I think it's just this not, this unwillingness to conform, or this willingness to be weird, or I think a lot of what draws me to bands of the 70s is that they didn't have predecessors to draw off of so heavily like we do today. They didn't have really bands to clone. And especially, I think that's what's fascinating to me about, psychedelic rock and progressive rock of that era, is just that they were really making stuff that was groundbreaking and far out. And they're experiments that are captured in time and space on records, and they're really fun to listen to for that reason. And I think maybe that's at the root of why I have a really hard time discovering bands that I can really celebrate nowadays, because it just feels so canned. It feels really like there's nothing authentic about a lot of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's as if they've kind of, more kind of photocopying. Yeah.
And we did that too, to a certain extent, definitely on our first LP, and, to a lesser extent on the second, but it's always, you can never completely get away from it. Not like we're completely original and groundbreaking now, but I try to stay mindful of that,
I think you definitely have to go through the process of like replicating something before you can, build on it.
Yeah, I would agree. You're probably pretty singular if you can manage to create without having heard anything in the past, emulating it a little bit.
I think maybe a difference might be that a lot of the bands in the past would have kind of done that kind of development, and that's kind of behind closed doors to a certain extent, in their own little area, in their city or scene that they were from. They'd do that development, and then as they changed, then they'd expand. Whereas now, if you put out music, it's essentially all over the world immediately.
There's a whole lot less of an incubation effect and a lot more immediacy. You can hear kind of anything you want from anywhere at any time, and at any time in history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's fantastic. But I guess at the same time, it has been detrimental, like we were talking about, people's attention spans, and takes a lot less to wow people nowadays, I think, than it used to. I don't know. I think I get depressed when I think and I talk too much about, music. The thing I really just love is just playing it, having an instrument in my hands, or just, being in front of a loud amplifier with my friends. That's kind of that's my happy space, if you will, and everything around it, the whole industry side of it, and, everything else conceptual we've been talking about, it gets kind of, can't talk about that too much, or you forget what's nice about the whole thing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Creative Process Podcast. Make sure to check out the show notes in our podcast section at overblown.co.uk. Here you will find links to everything mentioned in this episode. Overblown and the Creative Process Podcast are both an entirely DIY venture. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can become a patron of Overblown at patreon.com/overblown. See you down the front.